So, continuing our conversation about terrorism, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of radicalization and some of the scholarship on how we think people get drawn into extremist movements and potentially terrorist organizations. And so, we'll kind of talk through some of the ideas of profiling, some maybe different risk factors that might be associated with radicalization. And then I think we'll end with what I think is probably the most compelling sort of story about how this process of radicalization works and talk about sort of the sociology of radicalization. So the holy grail for sort of terrorism studies would be to be able to build a profile of a terrorist, like to be able to find markers that would be able to help you predict in advance whether somebody is going to become a terrorist, get involved in terrorism, or be prone to extremism. People have been looking at this and studying terrorist profiles and personality traits and childhood and anything that we can possibly measure about the person to kind of build these profiles, and we don't have anything yet. At least nothing that provides any sort of a real accuracy. We find sort of interesting things. So, example, we find that terrorists are disproportionately likely to have engineering backgrounds or to be doctors, medical doctors, and we can sort of look at that and say, well, that's a sort of an interesting correlation. We can maybe speculate about why that might be and say, well, in engineering, you're socialized and trained in the idea that if something isn't working right, it's a design flaw. It was poorly designed. You should go back and fix it and make it better. And maybe that makes engineers frustrated by kind of the normal operation of politics, which isn't optimally efficient, but instead involves a lot of horse trading and messiness that just sort of rankles engineers and thus makes them terrorists. Probably not. Likewise, doctors are trained that if there's something wrong, you respond to it with violence, right? You cut it out, or you burn it away, or you target it with chemicals or radiation, or you do something to destroy the thing, the pathogen, the cancer, the bad thing that's harming the body, and you do that to save the body, right? So there's this like built-in sort of how you fix things is through a form of violence, and then when you take that sort of mindset and transpose it onto politics, maybe that lends itself toward terrorism. We can tell these stories, but we're also aware that the vast majority of engineers don't go into terrorism, and the vast majority of medical doctors don't go into terrorism. And so we're left kind of grasping at these kind of straws when we're trying to build these profiles. And this is really the core problem of profiling, right? Is that we're looking at something that is really rare. Somebody being radicalized to the point of violence, something that occurs slowly, right? Something that takes place over the course of decades, and yet we're looking for markers that we can sort of identify now in the present, right? Gender, socioeconomic class, education level, focus of specialization, maybe your friendship network, have you lost a job, and anything that could possibly be a marker of that we could observe and measure and track and then correlate together. It's really difficult to do that, and to be able to predict a rare event that occurs sort of at one moment, but a process that's been playing out over a long period of time. And it's really hard to do that when people are engaged in secrecy, when people recognize that making plans to engage in violence is something that's likely to get the police called on you. They're going to hide their activities. They're going to hide the extent of their radicalization. And this gets actually to another problem with the whole idea of profiling and why it maybe is impossible to build a functional profile of a terrorist, and that is because terrorist groups are strategic. They know that people are hunting them. They know that people are looking and trying to profile and identify would-be terrorists, and so terrorist organizations act strategically to avoid that. And so Al-Qaeda kind of recognized that after September 11th, that law enforcement agencies kind of had their eyes out for people with a Middle Eastern background, and you were more likely to be sort of targeted for extra search and extra scrutiny. And so Al-Qaeda started thinking about, well, maybe we could pull folks in from Bosnia who are Muslim by background, and maybe we have an affinity, but appear and are Caucasian, and thus would be less likely to be pinged by the sort of profiling systems that were being set up after September 11th. once you have a profile, a terrorist organization can act strategically to circumvent that profile in terms of who they use and who they recruit. So this whole approach to profiling, I would say, has largely not borne a lot of fruit. But folks who study the psychology of radicalization have found that maybe there's other ways to think about it. Maybe we're not going to build a exact sort of, here are markers that we can sort of add up and say, if you have 9 of these markers, you're likely going to be a terrorist. But maybe to think about psychological and sociological elements that people who get involved in radical extremist groups maybe have in common. And so, the article that was assigned for today kind of highlights a couple of these common risk factors, right? And so one is emotional vulnerability and alienation. And so I think I encourage people to go and look at sort of the background of Tim McVeigh and how he struggled with relationships. He kind of lost his community through the military. He was having a hard time with work, right? So there's that element of alienation, dissatisfaction with one's current situation. Certainly, again, his dream of becoming a special forces soldier didn't pan out. He's working jobs he doesn't particularly care for. Identification with victims. He becomes very focused on the Waco standoff, and very upset with federal agents who stormed the compound and really sort of built this sort of empathy with the people who died in the Waco standoff. Moral flexibility on the use of violence. So McVeigh had been in Desert Storm. Allegedly, he had used violence there. He had maybe, he got deeply immersed in sort of the NRA kind of pro-gun movement, where there was lots of rhetoric about the need to use violence. But it was actually, I think, those sociological factors that ended up being really important for him. Risk factors are when you get sort of a reward from group membership, that you respond to that kind of social reward. And maybe that even becomes your social community, your network. And so with McVeigh, it was working in the gun show circuit that became sort of his community. We could point to other people who maybe follow this path. Chelsea Manning, who aligned with WikiLeaks and leaked a huge cache of classified documents, kind of fits a similar kind of profile: emotional vulnerability and alienation, sort of at an early stage of thinking about transitioning genders, dissatisfaction with the current situation, really miserable working in Iraq with the environment she was in at the time. The moral flexibility with violence wasn't necessarily as relevant there because the action that was being asked for wasn't necessarily a violent action, but it was really the social piece of the WikiLeaks group kind of rallying around Chelsea Manning, giving her a sense of community, being part of this group that she was really craving at that particular time. And it's that social connection that ends up being really powerful as a component of radicalization, which is also why the profiling approach doesn't work, because it's not about the individual, it's about the individual in relationship to this larger radicalization process. And so this is a diagram that isn't necessarily intuitive, but it's a nice little image. But it's my way of sort of thinking about a process described by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she sort of wrestles with this idea of how could a society sort of spin so wildly into these sort of radical extreme ideas. And her conclusion is that there's these nested sort of communities that people are able to move through. And in the nested communities, draw people in. So you start out in sort of a mainstream situation. Tim McVeigh, starts out in military circles. He's reading Soldier of Fortune. He's maybe interested in the NRA and gun rights, and that's all very mainstream and fine. But through that, he starts meeting people who are there. They're in those spaces, but they have some more extreme ideas. And so he starts, operating in sort of the gun show circuits and interacting there with people who are maybe part of the militia movement. And so he's sort of being pulled further and further along into these circles. And as he goes, he sort of loses people in sort of the mainstream, right? So he tries to convert his father and give him some of this literature associated with, the militia movement, and his father is like, I don't want anything to do with this, and they end up becoming estranged, right? So as you move into these fringe circles, that becomes the people you interact with. You start losing people in the mainstream that kind of become alienated from you, and that sort of pulls you further into this process until you start interacting with people who are talking about using violence, who are engaged in genuine radical movements. At which point, the fringe sort of community suddenly stops seeming quite as much like a home, and you start sort of pushing those folks away. And so McVeigh, drops his membership with the NRA, and he, eventually stops, going to gun shows, and he starts thinking about how to build bombs, right? So it's that process of radicalization that allows for a person to migrate from sort of a mainstream environment to a radical environment, but also helps insulate people who in those radical groups from the larger mainstream society by giving them sort of another group that they can interact with, that fringe that allows for them to continue engaging in society and continue operating, but without having to come into contact with those sort of mainstream views. And so I've always found Hannah Arendt's framework really insightful and compelling about this process of radicalization of people, and I think it fits really well with the story that we're telling about how extremism and radicalization really comes through a process of these different communities and people being drawn to these different communities. And so another way to think about this is maybe not this sort of linking circles, this chain, but instead to think about it as sort of a radical organization, movement, network, involving many different roles that people can play. And so you can initially, come to these networks in a very passive way. I read this web page, or I follow this account on TikTok, or I watch these particular media programs, and so I'm passively kind of getting exposure to these things, but I'm nodding along. But there's other people who are doing other things that are maybe more visible or more high profile, and people start desiring the prestige that's given to or granted to people who are doing these other tasks within this radical movement. And so people maybe become drawn to this more extreme behavior because they get a sense of, I want that reward that the group gives to that person. I want to be elevated the way that person is elevated. And so you're responding to this larger community. And this actually has allowed for a form of radicalization through the internet, where people are reacting to conversations that are happening on message boards and different forums online. And it's through these forums that they start urging each other and encouraging each other to take even more extreme violent actions, and then celebrating that and sort of creating this space for prestige and elevation of radical behavior. And so again, it's a little bit of a different process than what Hannah Arendt sort of describes of this sort of migration process. But I think it's a similar kind of idea that when we think about radicalization, it's not things about me necessarily. It's about the interactions I have with a community that pulls people into this process of extremism and radicalization.